again, today's topic is shift or die while your agency needs to move from PHP to JavaScript. We're going to be talking about architectural considerations, social considerations, and the strategic considerations of what you use as a stack and what that means as a company. A lot of that's driven by the modern responsive web, and a lot of that is about building apps and applications that run in a browser. So even if you're building a fairly straightforward website that has any kind of engagement, if you're running it on a mobile application, you need to make it very responsive, obviously, and you need to make it work well over different types of connections, and that often means running more in the browser. Ajax, the 2.0 web, a lot of that was based upon moving more into the browser to improve the user experience, and this has been a general trend for the last 10 years. At Rangle.io, we work with what we call the hat stack, HTML5, Angular, or application frameworks, and thin servers. And this is a key consideration in how you go about building modern web applications, because really most of what you're building is in the browser. And when you make decisions based upon that, that's where you should be starting with modern applications and web development. So when considering a shift from PHP to JavaScript, some of the questions are how JavaScript is defining the modern web, the benefits of full-stack JavaScript, why HTML5 and mobile changed everything. There's also a huge trend in the industry for software as a strategic advantage, which means larger code bases. We've worked with a number of agencies where they've taken on bigger projects, which were radically different from what they'd worked on previously, and they needed to augment their staff. Then there's recruiting and retaining staff. As software evolves, a decade ago, C++ was replaced by Java. There's .NET. There's the dynamic language revolution. And when you're looking at building a team, the social aspects of that languages have a big impact in platforms. And then ultimately, how we deliver software, whether it's Agile, DevOps approach, or continuous deployment, has a big impact on how we go about building stuff and the languages we use and how we build our teams. So what we want to consider strategically is what is being built. If you're building a very simple website that's static and it's a brochure, then you can use PHP or whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. You can use Perl for that matter. But how it's being built does have a huge impact. So if you're doing Agile development and you're embracing change in the future, then you got to think about testing and test coverage, continuous integration, communication, and putting together a team that can handle all of that effectively. And traditionally in PHP type agency development, there's been a huge upfront design phase, specs being built and signed off on, and then there's the delivery to that spec. And that's a different webinar in its entirety, but it's impossible to really be agile when there's a spec that has no one there to discuss it with you. So if you've had a project manager and a designer working with the client for 2 months and they've built out a spec, developers will ask some questions, but they're not going to ask a lot of them because there's just too much context that they don't have, and they're going to deliver it, and it's going to be handed over, and it's going to go to market, without the greatest efficiency in terms of what's being built and why. And then who's building it, and that kind of a team. If you want a team that's fully engaged, then you need an agile process. You need to have tools and methods in place. And so a lot of what would drive, or would need to support a shift to JavaScript in an agency model for delivering applications also aligns with what you're doing from a process perspective. A few important caveats. This talk's really about average cases. There are many exceptions, and context is everything. So, you can point out lots of things that would not really be applicable, or different cases. Obviously, Facebook uses PHP, and they're one of the most massive applications in the world. The main point that we're making is that larger and larger portions of the software market will demand JavaScript-based solutions, and what some of the reasons are for that, and to plan for that. So how JavaScript is defining the modern web. The modern web is really about the browser, and it's really about mobile, and a lot of things are shifting into the browser. So browser-based applications, Web 2.0. This is a slide that talks about Angular architecture. There's something called the mean stack, but the mean stack doesn't even encompass or describe really this shift. The app is moving to live in the browser. Websites may or may not, based upon what they need to do, but effective websites are becoming more dynamic and more engaging, and having a lot more code in them, and that's the natural progression. There's SEO considerations, but those problems are being solved. And with them being solved, one of the ways you can solve them more effectively is using JavaScript as your dominant language for building, and the concept of isomorphic JavaScript that you can render on the server or render in the client, and strategies like that. But ultimately, when you think about what websites are and what web applications are in the future, it breaks down into what's the app and what's the API, and that concept is changing significantly. Or I mean, you're thinking about what's the app and what's the API, and it's a separation of concerns. The HTML ultimately lives in the browser. The server manages the data and the storage, and the fact that servers generated pages and do generate pages is really just an anomaly of browsers not really being that effective historically. The truth about Web 2.0, it's been around for 10 years and counting. If you look at Gmail, if you look at Twitter, if you look at Outlook, this is not new, it's just accelerating. So if you extrapolate from server-side applications moving towards JavaScript in the browser and more JavaScript, one of the things that brought me over to JavaScript was working on a large Ruby application where I ended up, felt like, or effectively was writing the application twice. Once on the server side and once in the browser. And so if you look at where we're at, in 2005, 50% of any web app was JavaScript. In 2013, it was 70% JavaScript. Basecamp, a very popular Ruby application, was half Ruby and half CoffeeScript. And a lot of DBs speak JavaScript, but for this point, it's really JavaScript is becoming a huge part of the app. And the question people should be asking themselves now is, what is the primary language we're using? And if you want to include HTML, it's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then if we need to do something on the server side, think about it in terms of what you're picking. If you had to make that choice, we're already doing most of our development in JavaScript, and we need to add some server-side capabilities. That sort of attraction of full stack becomes pretty strong. And this is sort of like turning up the heat on a pot, and it goes from cold to warm to boiling. And JavaScript is sort of starting to enter the boiling phase where it's that hot and it's that important, and companies really need to account for that strategically. And so with that, there's the move to thin servers to sort of demonstrate that. This would have been your traditional application. We're moving more to a browser-centric web app, and the reason is we can. Browsers are amazing, and they have this capability. And this separation of concerns saves a lot of money in terms of development time. It allows for more elegant application architecture. It changes a lot of the dynamics of what a web application actually is. And so we move a lot of that functionality into the front end, and we end up with a very thin server ultimately. And this is thin server computing. Traditionally we created web pages, and we needed to make those pages change dynamically. We had to insert data into it. It's a very awkward architecture, and it's something that only becomes apparent when you build an application that doesn't have to do that, and you can decouple your business logic from your HTML rather effectively. I mean, this new stack, it is not just Buzz. All three tiers have changed. Your client is moving towards browser-centric JavaScript. The server is moving to a thin server. The database is becoming more document web-centric. What this means is that shift in proportion is massive, and that's where, again, you want to reconsider what's actually running on the server, because multiple languages impacts the velocity of delivery, it impacts the training, it impacts the type of staff you have to have, and ultimately it just becomes a barrier that's not really needed. This is an interesting networking principle that states application-specific functions ought to reside in the end host of the network rather than intermediary nodes, provided they can be implemented complete and correctly in end hosts. When I first read this, I was actually rather struck that this is exactly what's happening in the browser. And it's happening now because sort of completely and correctly is what's there. And that was what wasn't there before if you think about applets and Flash and other technologies. And so with this, there is actually this completely and correctly in place now, or close to it. There's still some SEO considerations, and that's driving the further acceleration of this as a practice. So with HTML5 and JavaScript and REST APIs, we've reached that stage where you're basically implementing a website or web application in the browser and connecting as needed. Why now? HTML5 is 95% of users. JavaScript engines provide near native performance. Mobile latency demands client-side applications. And ultimately, mixed model Web 2.0 AJAX applications are horrible to implement and maintain, duplicate significant code on the server and client. So, basically, our current model of building web applications is insane. And once you get past simple pages and you scale up into greater complexity and business logic, then it becomes more and more painful. The most important thing, though, is that this is sort of what's available in terms of a platform, and I don't think we would care that much if it wasn't for mobile and user experience demanding fast adoption, or being adopted fast and really demanding fast adoption of JavaScript to solve these problems. So this is really an architectural epiphany. This is why it's not just about libraries and it's not just about server-side or browser. It is fundamentally a different way of building applications, and that's why it's important to understand that from an architectural perspective. In terms of the process of building web pages and web applications, one of the big things you see with a modern framework is that you get a disentanglement where you can have your data and your behavior and your structure, your styling, all separated. And that's what we see when we can build HTML and we can build CSS and we can attach our behavior to it using JavaScript without actually having to generate the HTML and the CSS as we would do traditionally dynamically with server-side include type technologies. This is more of an Angular concept, but put another way, unobtrusive JavaScript is pretty awful in the sense that you have to look at a web page and not know what's going on, right? You have to go look at the page in the browser, and now you have to go back onto the server or back into jQuery if it's client-side and figure out what's going on. So deciphering the application or the website can be very difficult. Where something has, with Angular, you're actually decorating the HTML, you're extending the HTML, and reading the HTML is reflective of the application. And so you have something that's maintainable, understandable, and navigatable, which is very important in larger applications. So shifting to JavaScript, a few of the considerations. The ecosystem. So the modern web ecosystem is being built on JavaScript. The number of libraries, if you go to GitHub, if you look at what's out there, it's all JavaScript all the time now. And the build process, pretty much everything. So if you're looking to build modern web applications that support mobile and responsive, JavaScript is where everything is at, and so there's a huge value there. 80% of your application is JavaScript, so picking a second language, if you start from this position, needs a significant justification. And so if you back away from the way we've traditionally done things, and we have an application that's almost all JavaScript, or most importantly JavaScript, then thinking about it, do we really want to introduce a second language into that mix? And if we do, why? HTML5 and mobile, this demands a front-end JavaScript strategy for performance and user experience. So this is a significant consideration as well. The other thing is clean code, so separation of concerns, testing, and the amazing software engineering culture surrounding JavaScript. So when you're building an application that's getting larger and you think about what your long-term strategy is, and what you're trying to achieve from a cultural perspective, then there's just a lot more in the JavaScript community. So that's something to consider. The long-term software value, so what is this software going to do, for how long, how adaptable is it going to be, with clean code and sort of a more thorough software engineering approach, then this becomes much more of a consideration. Recruiting is an interesting one as well. The best developers, for cultural or other reasons, want to work with modern languages. And so if you're building a team and you're thinking of what kind of team you need for the scale of the application, like a larger application, I would be concerned generally trying to build a very large application using PHP because of the difficulty in finding the right developers to do that. There are a lot of PHP developers, but they work on smaller projects. And so I would be really thinking about language and culture as a foundation for doing a startup and what kind of language that I was going to use. Obviously, there are very large companies that have amazing PHP applications like Facebook. This is the general case, though, not specifically for any one company. For JavaScript as a language, it's come a long way. A lot of it came out of Douglas Crockford in his book JavaScript: The Good Parts, and the building of the ecosystem around JavaScript and the amazing frameworks like Angular, Ember, React, Backbone, D3, the tools, Node, Grunt, Gulp, and the entire sort of modern web development sort of pipeline that's built around that. JavaScript really does have an elegant, powerful core, has a clear spec, and a lot of its more gruesome anomalies are being fixed with ES6. ES6 is the next version of JavaScript, and if we're talking specifically about moving from PHP to Node, so we're going on a pure server-side approach, ES6 is a more, embraceable language by a lot of developers because it introduces classes and some other things that developers are used to working with. Though one of the attractions of PHP was its more functional approach, and JavaScript does have a strong functional approach as well, where you are just writing single-point functions to handle or do certain things. DevOps and CI, so your front-end framework, unit testing, CI, continuous deployment. A lot of this is built into the JavaScript community through and through. So if similar to what we saw in the Rails community, Rails had a built-in testing strategy. Testing was the default norm in the community. There are lots of great PHP testing frameworks and strategies, but it's not the norm. And when we see Node apps often that were built, when we see Node applications that were built using from a team that had migrated over from PHP or from other languages where they hadn't been used to working on larger applications, we see a lot of challenges in terms of what error handling is and what some of the testing practices are. Another key consideration is Agile and workflow. We talked a little bit about this before. Agile development requires clean code and stronger developers who can communicate and coordinate with the project learnings. And so when you think about a traditional agency delivery model, it's building out a spec, getting sign-off, and then building in PHP. When you're building an application, that's going to be much more organic. It requires different development practices, communication practices, and workflow practices. And this is something that's probably the biggest barrier in shifting from PHP to JavaScript in an agency setting, and why many don't really have the pressure to do so, because it's really the whole community and the culture and the expectation of clients. And I've worked with a lot of agencies in the Toronto market who are very keen to move to an Agile practice, but they can't figure out how to get their clients there. And I think this is going to be something that is going to take longer. But what we are seeing is that there's a huge spike in projects that do require more of a larger software engineering practice, and more Agile delivery model, as Agile permeates more and more of the industry, and it's becoming a lot easier to sell different clients in different industries on this approach. The other big impact is larger applications. Larger applications demand more elegant architecture and practices, and the JavaScript stack and community provides that. But ultimately, you have to do what makes sense. So this is a webinar. It's about theory, it's about strategy, culture, architecture, and ultimately, in any context, there are so many factors that you ultimately have to do what makes sense. PHP is great for server-based projects. There's some amazing frameworks, such as Laravel and Symfony, and for smaller projects with clear specifications and a waterfall approach for new developers, junior developers, with limited mobile requirements. But all of these are pretty significant sort of walls or boundaries of building an application working in the web, and it's something to consider, as a significant strategic concern in how you build out your team and your default tech stack. So that's the talk. It's a bit of a shorter talk. I ran through it a little bit quick to catch up a bit. But now we'll switch to any questions anybody has. Just post them through the chat box, and we'll answer sort of any questions. Thank you. So lots of questions on the sound quality. So we weren't using a speakerphone. It was something in the audio setup that normally works that just fell apart. So we switched to a different headset, and that seemed to solve most of our problems. So one question I have here is, can Node be a drop-in replacement for PHP on a project? So in some respects, it can be, but there are considerations. So PHP is particularly strong in taking a database and extracting an SQL data and presenting it to the end user. Node is much better for architecting components in a more modular application. It has SQL libraries, but it's not as sort of default practice as you might find with PHP. So you can find the right framework. You can put together a similar model that you would see. Like typically, PHP has moved very strongly towards the Rails model, and Node has similar frameworks. With the move to RESTful APIs for those kind of applications, it really is a separation of concerns. And Node provides a REST API, and your Angular JavaScript is providing, your front-end JavaScript is providing a lot of the application functionality. And so I think in that case, it's a drop-in replacement because PHP is being used as a more modern sort of MVC type web application framework. It really depends on the scope of the application. The question on application size. So generally, when you move up past, say, 2 to 3 developers on an application, and it's going over, say, 8 to 12 weeks, that's where you start seeing a lot more of an impact in terms of architecture. If you're doing a project that's less than 12 weeks and it's only 2 developers, there's actually not a lot of entanglement that you're going to run into from a code quality perspective. In terms of testing, it's even optional at that point. It really depends on what the life cycle of your application is. And so there's not a benefit, say, moving to that from just a pure technical perspective. It's a question of who your developers are at the time and if you want to invest in that training to switch them over. If you're working on an application that's bigger, that has to be much more agile, has to be delivered iteratively, needs to have changes, needs to be tested. You want to have a continuous delivery type of approach, and it's going to be updated over a longer period of time. Then I start seeing a lot more value in making the investments to move over. It really depends on where you're starting. Mobile app, so what is the specific impact for mobile? It's sort of interesting that Node grew up a lot in the mobile space for creating REST API servers. We've used Node in a lot of environments that use PHP, where we've taken a legacy PHP application, we've turned it into a REST API at one layer in the service-oriented architecture, and then Node provides the front end for all the sort of mobile and single-page application development, and we move in the session management, user management, caching with Redis, and other architectural considerations into the sort of the Node service layer. All right, so it looks like that's most of our questions for today. Oh, a couple more came in. How long does it take to build a mobile app and website through JavaScript? And so a mobile app would depend on what it does. Mobile apps actually tend to take a fair bit of effort because of the complexity of getting the right sort of user interactions in place. But generally, HTML and CSS are probably a good third of the application work in both cases. And then from a JavaScript implementation perspective, I would say that the development time would be similar to PHP, but the question becomes when the application gets bigger and you start running into maintenance and changes and collaboration across larger teams, then that's where you would see the speed pickup. But I can't answer that question in more detail without more context. A copy of the presentation will be available with the recording. And yeah, so there's actually a really good question about deployment. And so one of the great things about Node as a development platform is that it's much easier to set up. So typically when you're working with PHP or other languages, a lot of companies have to set up virtual machines to get people up and running. They have to maintain that, it has to have Apache, the right version of Apache, the right version of PHP, and they have to have that sort of managed in cross-staging and deployment. With Node, because of the sort of real emphasis on package management, you can have a single script that can set up a new machine with all of the libraries and everything that you need to actually do effective Node development. So it's a lot easier to provision on the development side. It's also extremely slick from a deployment perspective because of the way the ecosystem has been built around the package management right from the start. And so platforms as a service built around Node, such as Nodejitsu and Heroku and Azure, deploying and maintaining Node is actually really, really simple for the most part. It gets a little more complicated when you're starting to work on your caching layers, and now you're starting to put in Redis and other sort of components. But one of the sort of the beautiful aspects of a full JavaScript stack is the simplicity of deployment and management. All right, so thank you very much, and we will sort of close up the webinar if you missed any of it, or if you dropped off because of our sort of unfortunate sort of late start. We will be sending you around a recording and slides for your future reference. Thank you very much.